Welcome back. Today we're talking about myths surrounding sexual assault or sexual abuse. It is a serious topic, but it is an important one to address these types of myths that exist. I'm Natalie Gerry, the principal lawyer with Gerry Law. I help injured people get the compensation that they deserve for their injuries. Let's get into this topic today. Sexual violence, myths, and facts. There is a lot of information that circulates about sexual violence and the people affected by it. The following myths are common and can impact survivors of assault or abuse, as well as the behavior and effectiveness of friends, family, medical system, social services, and law enforcement personnel. This information helps to clarify some of the most common myths. Myth number 1, most victims of sexual assault can prevent the assault from taking place by resisting. The fact here is that assailants commonly overpower victims through threats and intimidation. Sometimes it can be psychological coercion or fear for their lives, so many survivors may not even fully recognize that they're being assaulted due to the shock and confusion at the time. Myth number 2, most sexual assaults are committed by strangers. The fact here is that statistics clearly show that the vast majority of sexual assaults are committed by someone close to the survivor, such as a family member, a friend, or an acquaintance. Myth number 3 is that victims can easily get over the effects of sexual assault or childhood sexual abuse. The fact here is that the effects of sexual assault or sexual abuse are far-reaching, impacting emotional stability, employment, and the ability to form and maintain relationships. Studies show that income is lower over a lifetime for survivors of sexual abuse as a child. The next myth is that most sexual assaults are not planned in advance, and the fact is that up to 3/4 of all sexual assaults involve some level of pre-planning by the assailant. The next myth is that sexual assault is commonly falsely reported. The fact here is that only about 2% or less of sexual assault reports are found to be false, and this is similar to other crimes. Next myth is that victims commonly dress in a way that increases their chances of being sexually assaulted. The fact here is that most assailants cannot even remember what the survivor or the victim was wearing at the time, and this shows that clothing is not a factor. Another myth is that if a drunk person consents to a sexual act, then the consent is valid. The fact here is that consent depends on whether the individual is capable of understanding what they are agreeing to, and severe intoxication may actually invalidate that consent. The next myth is that most survivors of sexual assault or sexual abuse are young, attractive females. The fact here is that the elderly are also commonly victims of sexual abuse, and it affects people of all ages, and especially commonly. The fact here is that it affects people of all ages. Even young men and boys are affected by sexual assault and sexual abuse. The next myth is that men are never sexually assaulted, and as I was just saying, this is unfortunately just not true. Sexual assault is more common among men than many believe, and boys are often victims of sexual abuse. The next myth is that sexual assault is a relatively rare form of abuse. This is just not the case, and the fact is that as many as 1 in 4 women will be sexually assaulted during their lifetime, making it one of the most common serious crimes. The next myth is that sexual assaults most often occur in public or outdoors. The fact is that 55% of rape or sexual assault victimizations occur at or near the victim's home. and 12% occur at or near the home of a friend, relative, or an acquaintance. The next myth is rape does not happen that often. The fact is that there are an average of 293,000 victims ages 12 or older of rape and sexual assault each year in the US. This means one sexual assault occurs every 107 seconds. So just under 2 minutes, every minute and a half, a sexual assault is happening. The next myth is that people that have been sexually assaulted will be hysterical and crying. So this is a common myth, and the fact is that everyone responds differently to trauma. Some may laugh, some may cry, and others may not show any emotion. It is really specific to the person. Behaving provocatively or drinking a lot means the victim was asking for it. The fact is that the perpetrator selects the victim. The victim's behavior or clothing choices do not mean that they are consenting to sexual activity. The next myth is that if a parent teaches a child to stay away from strangers, the child will not be abused. The fact is that 60% of child sexual abuse cases are perpetrated by someone the child knows outside of the family, and 30% are actually assaulted by family members. The next myth is that people with disabilities are at a low risk for sexual assault. The fact is, though, that people with disabilities are victims of sexual assault twice as often as people without disabilities. The next myth is that sex workers cannot be raped because they are selling sex. The fact is that sex workers have the right to give or withhold consent just like anyone else. They can consent or withhold consent to sexual activity, and therefore they can be sexually assaulted just like anyone else. The next myth is that getting help is expensive for survivors of assault, and the fact is that there are various ways that sexual assault survivors can get free or low cost help to deal with what they've gone through, and I will be providing a list of those services, some of them below, mostly for Canadians because I'm located in Canada. I'm Natalie Gerry. I'm a lawyer and I help people bring lawsuits after they've been sexually assaulted, not in the criminal context, but in the civil context. I have another video about what makes for a strong civil sexual assault lawsuit. Please check out that video. It will be linked below. The next myth is that most assailants have a history of mental or sexual problems. But the fact is that many assailants appear to live normal, functioning lives. Next myth, assailants are typically poor, uneducated, or of a certain race. So this is not true. And the fact is that there are no typical profiles of an assailant. They can come from any socioeconomic background and any race. The next myth is that it is not sexual assault if the assailant and the victim are married. So the fact here is that any sexual act that is not truly consensual is considered sexual assault, regardless of the marital status. Next myth is that the victim must show physical injuries for it to be legally considered sexual assault. So the fact is here that the presence or absence of physical injuries is irrelevant to whether the act is considered sexual assault, although physical injuries can result in more severe charges and increased damages in the civil context. The next myth is that sexual assault is an act of lust and passion and cannot be controlled. The fact is that sexual assault is about power, control, and is not motivated by sexual gratification. It is an act of violence as opposed to one of lust or passion. The next myth is that if a victim of sexual assault does not fight back, they must have thought the assault was not that bad or they wanted it. This is an old one that was pervasive and hopefully is now becoming more commonly understood not to be true. The fact is that many survivors experience tonic immobility or a freeze response during an assault. It's like a fight or flight response, but it's a freeze where they're physically unable to move or speak. The next myth is that a lot of victims lie about being raped or give false reports. So as discussed, only about 2 to 8% of rapes are falsely reported. And this is the same as other crimes. This is a very important one and one to recognize.